Hello, this is Jen Rubin, and this is Jen Rubin's Green Room. I hope those of you who celebrated had a very Merry Christmas. And for those of you like me who enjoy a day of English soccer, that they are on Tuesday when we are recording this, enjoying a full day of English Premier League soccer. But back to the real world, I suppose. At least part of the holidays are over. And before we get to the new year, there is news, in fact, that is happening. And today I want to talk primarily about the war and the reaction to the war in Gaza. The war continues, and it continues because Hamas will not cease. Israel has, in fact, according to news reports, made a proposal that would have Gaza essentially come to a peaceful halt. No more fighting. The Hamas leadership would surrender and perhaps even exit, and they would then begin the rebuilding process. The hostages would, of course, have to be returned. And according, again, to news reports, Hamas has rejected this. So every time you hear now the defenders of Hamas and the pro-Palestinian people, there's overlap there, but they're not completely contiguous, say Israel should propose a ceasefire. Israel should stop. They have proposed a ceasefire, and it would stop if Hamas would stop the killing and would stop holding their own people hostage. The president of the United States, Joe Biden, has continued to pressure Israel to, as he says, move on to the next phase of fighting, limit the firepower, engage in more precise fighting in this urban environment in which they're in. And in fact, that has happened. And that is why you see the number of Israeli soldiers, the IDF, increase, the deaths of those people increase. And understand what they are willing to do. Israel is willing to risk its own people to be more focused in its fighting. There aren't very many countries on the planet that would do that, but Israel has chosen to do that. Meanwhile, we get continuing reports of the horror that the hostages who were released and the hostages who remain are going through. I must say, I was greatly affected on Sunday, this past Sunday, when I went to the vigil in D.C. at the Red Cross building. It is a large building right across from the White House and the Executive Office building. And every week on Sunday, there is a meeting of people who come in support of the hostages and the hostage families. And although it was the day of Christmas Eve, there was a very substantial group of people there. And unlike the protests you see that are advocating free Palestine from the river to the sea, there's no anger here. There's no hostility. There's no calls for death to Hamas. To the contrary, what the plea is, both here in the United States and in mass rallies in Israel, is to free the hostages, make the hostages the priority, get them out. And if that means that Israel has gone as far as it can go, so be it. And there are now substantial demonstrations in Israel. There was a display in the Knesset, a protest within the Knesset, because Israelis themselves believe that Netanyahu has essentially given up on the hostages, that he is willing to fight to the last man and remove Hamas, whatever that means. How does he determine when they're all dead? How does he determine he's gotten every single weapon? But his plan is to continue fighting, perhaps forever, who knows, but not to prioritize the hostages. And that is creating a split within Israel, just as the West is now beginning to raise the cry that it's time finally for a ceasefire. In Israel, the Israeli people are making the same claim. So if you support a ceasefire, join hands with the Israelis who do want the hostages free, who are now reaching the point at which they say, we've reached diminishing returns at this point. We have gotten most of Hamas. We've gotten most of the tunnels, most of the weaponry. We need to get these people back. And I'll share with you the experience I had listening to one of the members of the hostage families. This was a man whose brother still remains in Gaza. In fact, his brother, his wife, and his 2 boys were all kidnapped on October 7. Since that time, his wife and the 2 children, in other words, this man's sister-in-law and nephews, have been released. And the children tell horror stories. They tell stories about being beaten with sticks, one of them kept by himself, apart from the other hostages, but with a family. Really a horror story for the children that they will have to live with, this trauma. And again, we hear from other hostage families that rape, sexual violence continue as they are being held hostage. This gentleman spoke so poignantly and so emotionally about his brother. You could see in his eyes this deep sadness, almost a deadness in his eyes, that he is getting to the point where he is nearly without hope. And yet he comes here, he's insistent on keeping his government, our government, focused on the hostages. And it was a poignant reminder for me that the Israelis, when you get down to it, do value human life, and they do value a sense of humanity. They are willing, again, to put themselves in danger, to sacrifice more IDF soldiers so that they spare civilians. They are willing to take a ceasefire now, as opposed to rooting out every single fighter for Hamas, because they do value the life of these hostages. And frankly, they do value the life of the Palestinians. At this vigil, this was a mix of American Jews and Israeli Jews. There were prayers and there were statements in support of the innocent Palestinians who suffer greatly. They have been killed. They have been traumatized as well because of Hamas. So I think as we think both backward and forward as to where we are, we need to remember how this began with the horror on October 7 and begin to think about how this ends. And I hope we are much closer to the end than we were previously. And I hope that the voices within Israel are heard and that the government heeds their cry. I want to ask you, however, in anticipation of next week, I am going to hold a special session of Jen Rubin's Green Room. We're going to have a Ask Me Anything. And although anything can be misinterpreted, I'm sure, you can ask me stuff that has nothing to do with politics. You can ask me about movies. You can ask me about pets. You can ask me about travel, whatever you like. So send your questions in to my Threads account. That is Jen Rubin 9, the number 9. And 9 has no significance. It's simply that Jen Rubin 1 through 8 was taken. But Jen Rubin 9, send your questions in, and I'll answer as many of them as I can next week. And we should have some fun with it. So I look forward to getting them. And remember, tell your friends not only about next week's Ask Me Anything, but about Jen Rubin's Green Room. They can listen and they can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever they get their podcasts.